Hey students, welcome to the video lecture of object analysis use case modeling. So, identifying the use cases. Use cases is a very important concept in the object analysis. Use case capture how the users are using the system. In the analysis phase, the process of extracting the need of the system and what the system must do to satisfy the user requirement is known as the analysis. The goal of the analysis phase is to understand the domain of the problem and system responsibilities. Domain of the problem and system responsibilities, and how to know how user use or will use the system. How the user is going to use the system is captured in this analysis phase. The main objective are to capture a complete unambiguous. Unambiguous means error-free and consistent picture of the requirement of the system. How to view the system from user's perspective. We have to view the system from the user's perspective. Analysis is a process of transforming a problem definition from a fuzzy set of facts and myths. Analysis is a process of transforming the problem definition from a fuzzy set of facts and myths into coherent statement of system requirement. So it may be some facts, it may be given by the user, it may be in the form of myths, but we have to capture it properly into a system requirement. User needs have to be transformed into a set of problem statement and requirements. The user needs has to be transformed into set of problem statement and requirements. This is known as a requirement determination. It involves a great deal of interaction with the people who will affected by the system. It involves great deal of interaction. You have to interact with the user. User is going to use the system, or you will going to use the system. You have to interact with the people. Information can be extracted by examining the existing system documentation. You have to examine the existing system documentation, descriptions given by the user, interviews. You have to interact with the user. You have to conduct an interview with the user. Okay, direct an interview with the user. Questionnaire, circulating the questionnaire, and observations. So observation from, for example, maybe a role play, or you can develop a prototype and ask the user to use the system, and this is known as observation. By so generally the observation, the requirement, the person responsible for requirement capture, requirement engineering is a silent observer. So examining the existing system documentation and conducting the interviews, and so through this the questionnaire and observation, we are able to capture the requirements. Input to this phase are user requirements. User requirements are input to the analysis phase. It is a creative activity. How to understand the problem and associated constraint and method of overcoming those constraints. And we have to use as a analyst has to understand the problem and the constraints in the problem, and method of overcoming those constraints should be properly captured. It is not in processing. It is an iterative process. The goal on it goes on until the problem is well understood. It's an iterative process. It goes on. The problem is well understood. So, what is an analysis activity? Norman is an expert. Is point out the three most common sources of requirement difficulties. So, what is an analysis? Why analysis is a difficult activity? Norman points out three most common sources of requirement difficulties. Fuzzy descriptions. Description may be unambiguous and fuzzy. It's confusing. For example, fast response time. For example, it is not properly. There is no what to say. A quantitative value. Fast response time is a very general term. User interpretation, analyst interpretation might be very different. Okay, fast response time means unless does not understand what user is mentioning it as a fast response time. Next one is the incomplete requirements. Certain requirements needed might not have been included because user forgetting to identify them. Okay, some requirements are not identified by the user. High cost. Implementing a requirement if you have a high cost. Politics within the business, and sometimes actually the manager may not supporting. Oversight by the system developer. Oversight by the system developer. Because of the object-oriented analysis is an iterative, it is an incomplete requirement can be identified in the subsequent tries. Unnecessary features are the another problem. Every additional feature could affect the perception, complexity, stability, maintenance, and support cost of the application. If you add every additional feature, if you user reveal every additional feature, it will affect the perception, complexity, stability, maintenance, support cost of application. If the primary task is selecting a single object, extending it to select the multiple object could make the frequent simple task very complicated. Deadlines affect the product. Analysis is a difficult activity. How to learn by experience? An analyst has to learn by the experience. So fuzzy descriptions, incomplete requirements, and as well as unnecessary features are the complexity in the requirement analysis activity, difficulties in the requirement analysis activity. Next, we have to discuss about the business analysis, understanding the next we have a business object analysis, understanding the business layer. Is the next topic we are going to discuss. The main goal is to understand the user requirement. The outcome is to identify the classes that make up the business layer. So the business layer class, generally the business layer is a core layer which having a classes which address the user's requirement. Okay, so you have to identify the class of the business layer and relationship between the classes. How to know how the user uses the system. This can be accomplished by developing the use cases, and you have to discuss with the domain experts or users. Try to understand the expected input and desired responses. State what must be done, not how it should be done. So in this state, it clearly tell that what must be done, how it should be done, it will be considered in the design phase. Prepare a prototype, a valuable tool during the business object analysis of the user interface, which will help in understanding how the system will be used. One use case are designed, documented, and model the application, then proceed to design and implementation. Once use case are designed, documented, and modeled, then model application, then proceed to the design and implementation. Not an easy task to separate what from how. Okay, then actually what and how are, it is very difficult to separate. Use case driven object oriented analysis. The object oriented analysis consists of the following steps. Identify the actors, who is using the system. In case of new system, who will be using the system. Develop a simple business process model using UML activity diagram. Develop use cases. What are and will are the users are doing with the system. Use case provide us with a comprehensive document of the system under study. Perception interaction diagram. So develop a sequence diagram, develop a collaboration diagram. Classification. Develop a static UML class diagram. In this, identify the classes, identify the relationship, identify the attributes, identify the methods, iterate and define. If needed, repeat the preceding steps. So the steps of the object analysis are: identify the actors, develop a simple business process model using UML activity diagram, develop use cases, prepare interaction diagram, classification, develop a static UML class diagram, iterate and refine. Next, the business process modeling. Not necessarily done at the start of every project, but when required, business process and user requirement may be modeled and recorded. It consists of the process and application that support them. The model of a re-engineering process, implementation of the system. It is a time-consuming process. Advantage is that developing a business model will make us familiar with the system and the user requirement and aids in developing the use cases. An activity diagram also could be developed. Use case model. Use case model represents the external view of the system. That means a what model. Object model represents the internal view of the system. Shows how the business is run, how model. Static relationship between the object, inheritance, and association, and the other relationships are identified. Use case is a sequence of transaction in a system whose task is to yield the result of a measurable value to the individual actor of the system. So given by the Jacobson. So guideline for addressing the various variations in the use case modeling. First one is capture the simple and normal use case first. First, capture the simple and normal use case. For every step in the use case, ask what would go wrong here. The first question. Second, how much this work out differently. So these questions should be asked. Extract the common sequence into a new shared use case with the use case association. To add a more specialized and exponential use cases, use the existing use cases with the extend association. So how detailed the use case should be. So too much detail may not be useful. If you have provided too much detail in the use case, it may not be useful. For each package, create a child use case diagram. For every package, create a child use case diagram. On a child use case diagram, draw all the use cases of the domain with the action and interaction, and refine the use cases. Make use of the extend and users relationship. Capture the use case is the primary task of analysis phase. Most use cases are captured at the beginning of the project, but more will be uncovered as we proceed. Number of use cases needed. So Ivar Jackson states that for a 10% year project, you would expect 20 use cases. Florence Scott says 100 use cases for the project for the same magnitude. So no magic formula to decide how many use cases are required for a project. UML specification recommends at least one scenario to be prepared for each significantly different kind of use case instance. Each scenario shows a different sequence of interaction between the actors and the system with all decision definite. Okay, it should be different. Every use case should be different. Once we set the lowest use case level, then sequence and collaboration diagram can be drawn. So then dividing the use case into packages. Each use case represents a particular scenario in the system. A design is broken down into packages. Naming the use case. Use case name should provide a general description of the use case function. Name should be expressed what happens when an instance of the use case is preferred. Name should be an active, a verb, a borrow, or verb and noun, borrow books. Description should be described and consistent. Documentation. So these are all about the use cases. Next one is documentation. Documentation is very important work in all the analysis, design, and implementation testing process. So developing an effective documentation provide a valuable reference point and a form of communication. Helps reveal the issues and gaps in the analysis and design. It serves as the communication vehicle among the project team members. It is a very difficult to document a poorly understood system. A very difficult to document a poorly understood system. The main issue in documentation to the analysis phase is to determine what the system must do. The decision about how the system work is done during the design phase. Decision about how the system work is done during the design phase. So for this, we have to effect documentation should cover all these points. Organizing convention for documentation. Documentation depends on the organization rules and regulation. Most organizations have their own conventional standard for the documentation. Too little documentation invite a disaster. Too much documentation transfer the energy from the problem solving task to a mechanical unordinary activity. So documentation should not be too little. Documentation should not be too much. It should be in the consistent. It follows the organization rules and regulation, and organization have their own conventions and standards of the documentation. It should follow that. Guideline for developing effective documentation. So this is very important. Common cover. All documentation should have a common cover that identifies the documentation, the current version of the individual response for the content. 80-20 rule. 80% of the work can be done by the 20% of the documentation. Ensure that 20% is easily accessible and the rest 80% is available to those who need to know. Familiar vocabulary. Use a vocabulary that readers can understand. Main objective is to communicate with the readers, not to impress them with the buzzwords. You have to use the simple vocabulary. Make the documentation as short as possible. So eliminate the repetition. Present summaries, reviews, organization chapters in less than 3 pages. Make the chapter heading task oriented so that table of content could serve as index. Organize the documentation. Use rule of good organization. Most cases will provide documentation capability by providing a customizable representation. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Thanks for watching. We discussed use case modeling and as well as